The rain was a relentless, drumming curtain of gray, washing the color from the world for 7 long days and nights. In the wooden house perched on the mountain's edge, the air was thick with the scent of wet earth and wood smoke. Lena waited, her body tense, until the last ember in the stone hearth collapsed into a mound of dull, crimson ash. The only sounds were the rhythmic patter on the roof and the ragged, wet cough of her mother-in-law, Madame Suri, from the adjacent room. Her husband, Jean, slept the deep, untroubled sleep of the physically exhausted, his breathing a steady counterpoint to the storm. Lena's heart was a cold, heavy stone in her chest. She moved with the silence of a shadow across the creaking floorboards to the wooden shelf where the small, brown glass bottle stood, a sentinel of health. Her fingers, cold and trembling, closed around it. The glass was cool against her skin. With a furtive glance towards the doorway of the sleeping quarters, she knelt before the great clay stove, her knees pressing into the hard-packed earth. She worked a loose stone free from its base, revealing a dark, dusty hollow. She placed the bottle inside, the simple act feeling monstrous. "Just this one dose," she whispered into the waiting darkness, a flimsy shield against the guilt already coiling in her gut. "The merchant will come tomorrow. She will never know." As the stone slid back into place with a final, grating sound, the entire house seemed to let out a long, low groan, the timbers shifting as if roused from a deep slumber. And from the other room, Madame Suri's coughing fit escalated, turning into a desperate, gasping struggle for a single clear breath. To understand the profound sin of that hidden bottle, you must first know the woman whose life depended on it. Decades ago, a plague known as the sweating fever had descended upon our village like a poisonous fog. It was a cruel sickness, taking the strong and sparing the weak, leaving behind a trail of grief and empty chairs at hearthsides. But Madame Suri, then a young woman with a spirit as fierce as a mountain hawk and a heart as deep as the Spirit River, would not yield. While others barricaded their doors in fear, she walked in the mist-shrouded forests, her basket over her arm, gathering rare herbs that grew only where the river whispered to the stones. She moved from one stricken household to the next, her presence a beacon of hope. She cooled burning brows with cloths soaked in willow bark tea. She sang old, strengthening songs in a voice that could calm a crying child, and she held the hands of the dying, ensuring no one left this world alone. She saved countless lives, asking for nothing, her payment in the smiles of the recovered. The villagers, their hearts swollen with a gratitude that words could not hold, began to call her the river's daughter. One evening, as she wiped the brow of the last surviving child of the blacksmith's family, her friend, Anya, grasped her work-worn hand. "The river has blessed us all through you, Suri," Anya whispered, her voice hoarse with her own recent recovery. Madame Suri had looked up, her gaze drifting towards the window and the ever-flowing water beyond, her expression solemn. "The spirits of the river remember every kindness," she replied, her voice soft but firm. "But be warned, my friend. They have long memories for promises, too, and they never, ever forgive one that is broken." The memory of the village's savior was still vivid, a golden legend passed down to wide-eyed children, when Jean brought his new bride home from the distant plains. Lena was like a bird of paradise among crows. Her clothes were of finer cloth, her manners more refined, her beauty sharp and undeniable. The villagers came bearing humble gifts, woven reed baskets, smoked meats, and jars of preserved berries. They smiled and welcomed her, but their smiles often faltered when they met her eyes. "She's a painting come to life," the old midwife, Hannah, had muttered to the baker's wife, but her eyes never bow. They measure and they judge. To Lena, the towering, misty mountains felt like the walls of a prison, and the constant drizzle was a dreary torment. The humble wooden house, though sturdy and warm, was a profound disappointment. To welcome her, Madame Suri, her hands now gnarled with age, but their touch still gentle, had presented Lena with a beautiful silver hairpin, its end carved into the delicate shape of a blooming lotus flower. "For the daughter of my heart," the old woman said, her voice brimming with sincere hope and warmth. Lena accepted it with a graceful dip of her head, a perfect, polished smile gracing her lips. "Thank you, mother," she said, the title feeling foreign on her tongue. But the smile was a carefully crafted mask, and it did not reach her cold, unyielding eyes, which were already calculating the value of the silver. As the days turned into weeks, the seed of discontent planted in Lena's heart began to sprout thorns. She watched, her stomach knotting, as Jean doted on his mother. He would rush to bring her tea before she could even ask, his voice dropping to a soft, affectionate tone reserved only for her. He would spend the long evenings seated at her feet, listening to her tales of the old days, his laughter a warm, genuine sound that echoed through the house. A laughter Lena felt she seldom inspired. The silver hairpin in her hair began to feel not like a gift, but like a chain, heavy and cold. One afternoon, as she passed by the slightly ajar door of Madame Surrey's room, she heard the low murmur of voices and paused, hidden in the shadows of the hallway. "This house, this land, it has been in our family for generations," Madame Surrey was saying to Jean. "It will all be for you and your wife one day." Lena's breath caught in her throat, a spark of anticipation igniting. But the old woman's tone turned grave. "But remember, Jean, an inheritance is not just land and wood. It is a legacy of how we have lived. I will leave it only to those who prove themselves kind and true of heart, who could be stewards of its spirit." The spark in Lena's heart was doused by a cold wave of insecurity and resentment. The very next morning, Madame Surrey's voice was thin and reedy. "Lena, my dear," she called from her bed, the words punctuated by a shallow cough. "Could you bring me my medicine? My chest feels tight, like a clenched fist." Lena was in the main room, sweeping dried mud from the floor. She stopped, her grip tightening on the rough wooden handle until her knuckles turned white. This was it, the first step. She walked to the doorway, arranging her features into a mask of gentle concern. "The medicine, mother," she said, her voice sweet and cloying as honey. "I'm so sorry. The merchant from the valley, he has not returned. The rains must have washed out the mountain path again." Madame Surrey's face, already pale, seemed to lose another shade of color. A flicker of something, fear, understanding, passed through her kind, clouded eyes. But she simply nodded, a slow, weary gesture, and leaned back against her pillows, accepting the lie. That night, Lena slept fitfully. She dreamed of dark, cold water seeping up from between the floorboards, silent and inexorable. It encircled her bed, rising slowly, its surface unervingly. Still, it did not speak in words, but in a feeling that coiled around her heart like a vine, a deep, primal sense of dread, of a terrible price waiting to be paid. The following dawn broke under a strange, oppressive silence. The relentless rain had finally ceased, leaving the world dripping and hushed. Yet, the Spirit River, which curled like a sleeping serpent around the village, was swollen and high, its waters a churning, angry brown. It lapped at the bases of the willows that usually stood well clear of its banks. The villagers gathered in small, anxious clusters, their voices low. "There's been no rain in the valley for days," the woodcutter, Beau, stated, his brow furrowed in confusion. "Where's all this water coming from?" It was an ill omen, a defiance of nature. Lena, feeling suffocated by the heavy air in the house and the weight of her own secret, took a basket of dirty clothes to the riverbank, seeking a distraction. As she bent over the fast-moving, treacherous water, the silver hairpin, the gift she had never truly valued, loosened from her hair. It fell into the current with a soft, almost apologetic plink. She lunged for it, her fingers brushing only cold water. It was gone, but for a single heart-stopping moment, she thought she saw it, deep in the murky depths, glow with a faint, ethereal blue light before the river's hungry current swallowed it whole. The village doctor, A weary man named Kale with lines of compassion etched deeply around his eyes came to check on Madame Suri later that day. He listened to her heart with his leather-bound stethoscope, his expression growing graver with each labored beat. He took Jean aside by the fireplace, his voice a low, urgent rumble. "Your mother's condition is worsening, Jean," he said, his eyes full of concern. "The medicine I gave her is not a simple tonic. It stabilizes the rhythm of her heart, like a mason repointing old stones. She must not miss a single dose. Her life depends on the consistency of it." Jean, his face pale with his son's fear, nodded vigorously, promising he would be more vigilant, that he would personally ensure she took it. As the doctor turned to leave, pulling on his worn coat, his eyes fell upon the floor near the wooden medicine shelf. It was still damp from Lena's earlier return from the river. There, clear against the dry, planked wood, was a single, faint wet footprint leading away from the chest, a silent, damning testimony to the lie that hung in the air. Madame Suri grew visibly weaker with each passing sunset. The vibrant woman who had once single-handedly nursed a village back from the brink of death was now a pale, fragile ghost propped up on a nest of pillows. Her hands, which had once soothed fevers and ground healing herbs, now trembled with a constant, uncontrollable palsy. Yet her spirit, somehow, remained unbroken and gentle. When Lena brought her a bowl of thin, flavorless broth, Madame Suri used a moment of fleeting strength to grasp her daughter-in-law's hand. Her skin was papery and cool. "Thank you, my dear," she whispered, each word a struggle, a dry rustle of leaves. "You are so good to care for this troublesome old woman." The praise was a poison arrow, striking deep into Lena's heart, the venom of guilt spreading rapidly. As Lena held the carved wooden cup of water to her mother-in-law's cracked lips, she noticed the water inside the cup was trembling, not from the old woman's shaking hand, but from a strange, internal agitation, a series of tiny ripples that moved across its still surface from the center outwards, as if a single, heavy drop of water had fallen into it from an unseen height. Deeply troubled, her mind racing with excuses and denials, Lena fled to the stone well behind the house. She needed to draw water for the evening meal, but more than that, she needed to see her own familiar, determined face to reassure herself of her own control over this spiraling situation. The sky above was a sheet of dull, unbroken gray. She leaned over the mossy, cold stone rim, peering down into the profound blackness below, waiting for her reflection to coalesce in the dim light. But the face that looked back at her was a grotesque parody. It was her face, yes, but it was gaunt and sickly pale, the skin stretched taut over sharp cheekbones. The eyes were sunken into dark, bruised sockets, and the lips were tinged with a frightening shade of blue. The reflection in the water gasped, its mouth opening in a silent, desperate plea for air, its own hand flying up to clutch at its chest in a mirror of Madame Suri's suffering. Lena stumbled back from the well with a strangled cry, landing hard on the muddy ground. From the depths of that dark, cold shaft, a voice, clear and cold as mountain ice, echoed softly upwards, wrapping around her. It whispered 3 words that froze the very blood in her veins. Debt must be paid. That evening, as a new, more violent storm began to brew over the jagged mountain peaks, the thunder of a horse's hooves shattered the village's uneasy peace. A rider, a young messenger from the Valley Hospital, galloped into the center of the village, his horse lathered and wild-eyed. He slid from the saddle and hammered on Jin's door with a frantic fist. "A message from the hospital," he cried as Jean wrenched the door open, his face etched with alarm. "They have been tracking the special medicine they dispensed to Madame Suri. Their records show it was delivered weeks ago. They said it cannot be lost, that it is accounted for." The messenger's eyes were wide with a fear that went beyond his frantic ride. He looked from Jin's utterly confused face to Lena's, who had appeared in the kitchen doorway, her features a mask of terrified stillness. "The head doctor said, he said to tell you that the medicine was sealed with the spirit healer's vow." The messenger stammered, his voice dropping to a superstitious whisper. breaking that vow. He said it brings a curse upon this entire house and all within it. The messenger's desperate words stirred a long-dormant memory in the oldest villagers, a tale told to them by their grandparents in hushed, reverent tones. Long ago, when Madame Suri was a young woman, she had been fetching water when she saw the spirit healer's young daughter playing too close to the bank, slip into the river during the spring melt. The current was a roaring, icy beast. Without a single thought for her own safety, Madame Suri plunged into the freezing, turbulent water, fighting the pull of the current to drag the gasping child back to the safety of the shore. In gratitude, the reclusive spirit healer, a being of immense and ancient power bound to the river, appeared before her. "For your courage and your selfless heart," the healer said, her voice the sound of water flowing over smooth stones, "I will bind my power to your medicine. It shall protect your heart, and its strength shall shield those who protect you for all your days." But as Madame Suri, soaked and shivering, turned to leave, the healer called out one last grave warning, her voice now taking on the roaring force of the river and flood. "But know this, child of the land. If another, one who shares your hearth but not your heart, hides this gift out of greed or malice, the blessing will reverse. A curse will fall upon them, and every harm they intended for you will return to them threefold." Back in the present, in the storm-lashed house, Jean stood frozen in the doorway, the messenger's words washing over him like a physical blow. Before he could form a single question, a heavy, sickening thud came from Madame Suri's room. He rushed in to find his mother collapsed on the hard floor beside her bed, her body limp, her breathing so shallow it was almost undetectable. "Mother!" he screamed, his voice cracking with a terror he had never known. "I must get the doctor. Lena, stay with her." He shoved past Lena, who stood like a statue carved from ice, and ran out into the teeth of the growing storm, his cries swallowed by the wind. Lena was left utterly alone in the main room. The wind howled like a banshee outside, and thunder crashed directly overhead. Through the rain-streaked window, she saw a lone storm lantern, which Jean had lit to guide his return, hanging from a hook by the gate. As she watched, paralyzed, its warm, flickering yellow flames sputtered, turned a deep, unnatural shade of electric blue, and then burned with a steady, malevolent glow, casting long, dancing shadows that seemed to reach for her with skeletal fingers. There was no wind strong enough to blow it out, and no one was there to hold it. The storm was no longer just a force outside. It had become a living entity within the very walls of the house. The wind screamed through every crack and knothole, making the whole structure groan and shudder as if it were about to be torn from its foundations. Lena, trembling so violently her teeth chattered, backed away from the terrifying blue light of the window. Then she heard it, a faint, rhythmic rattling coming from the kitchen, a sound separate from the chaos of the storm. It was a dry, insistent shaking. She crept towards the sound, her heart hammering against her ribs. It was coming from beneath the stove, from the dark, hollow space where she had hidden her shame. The stones she had used to conceal, they were vibrating, clacking against each other. Suddenly, with a sharp, explosive crack, one of the larger stones split clean in two. From the hollow, a faint, glowing mist, the color of a drowned moon, seeped out. It did not dissipate. It swirled in the air before her, forming a nebulous, shifting shape, and on the howling wind that ripped through the house, she heard her name being called, not by one voice, but by a chilling chorus of whispers that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Lion, the dead. Lion, terrified beyond reason, Lena stumbled backwards into the main room, crashing against the wall. Her eyes darted wildly and landed on the small, polished bronze mirror that hung near the door. She lurched towards it, desperate for a glimpse of her own reality. But the reflection that stared back was no longer just a hint of illness. It was a perfect, horrifying replica of Madame Suri's mortal suffering. Her skin was waxy and corpse-like. Her lips were a bruised, purplish blue, and deep, dark circles hung like bruises under her hollow eyes. As she watched, the reflection clutched its own chest, its mouth opening in a soundless scream of agony. At that exact moment, Lena felt a sudden, vice-like tightness in her own chest, a pain so sharp and crushing it stole her breath away. A dry, hacking cough, a perfect, wrenching echo of the sound she had grown to ignore from the other room, tore through her body, bending her double. She was being mirrored, her own body turned into a prison, showing her the visceral, physical truth of her actions. She opened her mouth to scream for Jean, to call for anyone to help her, but the only sound that filled the house, drowning out even the storm, was the relentless, roaring rush of the river, now sounding as if it were flowing directly beneath the floorboards, ready to burst through and claim her. The cacophony and the unnatural fury of the storm had drawn the brave villagers from their homes. They arrived at the house, carrying their lanterns, their faces set in grim masks of determination and fear. The old midwife, Hannah, her back bent with age, but her eyes seeing the world in layers invisible to others, entered first without knocking. She took one long look at Madame Suri lying deathly still on her bed, and then her ancient gaze fell upon Lena, who was slumped against the wall, clutching her chest and gasping like a fish out of water. Hannah nodded slowly, as if a dreaded prediction she had carried for years had finally come to pass. "The balance has been broken," she intoned, her voice cutting through the supernatural din with an unexpected power. "The river spirits are not angry. They are just. They are here to claim what is owed, to restore the equilibrium that was shattered by a selfish hand." She turned her piercing, knowing eyes to Lena, who cowered under the gaze. "The curse has taken root in the liar's heart, feeding on her deceit. Only a full and honest confession, spoken before the one she wronged while her heart still beats, can seal what greed has unbound." Jean, who had fought his way back through the storm with the doctor, fell to his knees beside Lena on the hard floor. He took her cold, trembling hands in his own hands warm and calloused from work. "Lena, please," he begged, his voice thick with tears and a confusion that bordered on agony. "What have you done? What is happening? You must tell me the truth. Please." Lena looked into her husband's eyes, seeing his profound pain and his enduring love warring with his terror. For a moment, the truth was a burning coal in her throat, desperate to be spat out, to end this torment. But then her gaze shifted to the gathered villagers crowding the doorway, their faces a mixture of horror, pity, and accusation. Pride, that cold and stubborn serpent, tightened its coils around her heart and sealed her lips. She shook her head, a frantic, jerky motion, and turned her face away from him, hiding her eyes. As she did, the blue lantern hanging outside the window flared with a violent, silent intensity, exploding into a shower of icy, blue sparks that were instantly swallowed by the lashing rain. The spirit river was no longer merely at their doorstep. It was becoming their doorstep. Murky, churning water surged up from the very soil, defying nature, swirling around the foundation of the house in a frenzied, glowing moat. It didn't seep in through the cracks, but held the structure in a watery, possessive grip, as if the house itself were now an island in the spirit world. And within the water, faces began to form, pale, spectral visages woven from current and memory, with eyes that were pools of flowing, ancient water. Their mouths were open and silent, mournful songs of judgment. The entire moat of water glowed with the same faint, malevolent blue light Lena had seen in the well and the escaping mist. As one, the multitude of faces in the water turned towards the house, towards Lena. A single spectral hand, sculpted from liquid and cold, blue light, rose from the swirling flood. It moved slowly, deliberately, with a terrible purpose, not towards the door, but pointing directly through the wall, straight at the place where Lena's heart beat its frantic, guilty rhythm. The heavy wooden door, which Jean had barred against the storm, swung open without a sound. The iron latch did not lift. The wooden bolt did not slide. It simply opened, as if the house itself were granting entry. Standing in the doorway was a woman. She was dressed in robes as white and shifting as river foam, and her hair flowed long and dark, moving with a life of its own like waterweed in a gentle current. She was utterly untouched by the lashing rain and howling wind, a pocket of absolute, terrifying stillness in the heart of the chaos. It was the spirit healer, her face as timeless and unreadable as the mountain stone, her presence making the air hum with power. Her eyes, deep and old as the river's source, swept over the scene. The dying woman, the terrified son, the guilty daughter-in-law, the stunned villagers, and settled on Lena. She did not need to ask what had happened. The truth was written in the air, in the water, in the failing beat of two hearts. She raised a slender hand, and her voice, when she spoke, was the sound of the river itself, calm, immense, powerful, and utterly inevitable. "You," she said, her gaze pinning Lena to the spot, "have broken the sacred promise that was bound in water and breath. You have traded a life for your selfish desires." The spirit healer did not move from the doorway, but for Lena, the world dissolved into a vortex of shadow and memory. She was no longer in the crowded, storm-lashed house. She stood in a vast, dark space, a void where the only light came from shimmering, circular pools of water that lay at her feet like liquid mirrors. In each pool, a scene played out with painful clarity. She saw herself, her face sharp with resentment, hiding the first bottle. She saw herself days later, with more confidence, hiding the second. She saw her own visage, twisted with bitter envy as she watched Jean laugh with his mother. She saw Madame Surrey's trusting, gentle smile, and her own cold, calculated false smile in return. Each act of cruelty, each whispered lie, each moment of hidden malice was reflected back at her, amplified, and with each vision, the searing pain in her chest tightened another degree. The struggle for a single clean breath grew more desperate, a physical manifestation of her suffocating soul. The whispering voices of the river returned, swirling around her in the darkness, no longer a chorus, but a unified, judgmental tone. "Confess," they hissed, the sound like water over gravel. "Confess and be free of this weight. Unburden your soul, or choose to drown, not in water, but in the eternal, crushing silence you have created for yourself." The vision shattered, and Lena was violently thrust back into the overcrowded, tense room, collapsing onto the hard-packed earth floor. The weight of what she had seen, the sheer, unvarnished ugliness of her own actions, the monstrous shape of her envy, crushed the last vestiges of pride from her. It was a physical expulsion. She crawled on her hands and knees, like a wounded animal, to Madame Surrey's bedside, where the old woman lay unconscious, her breath a faint whisper. Great, heaving sobs, torn from the very core of her being, racked her diseased body. She took Madame Surrey's frail, cold hand and pressed it to her own fevered brow, the touch of the woman she had wronged a brand of her shame. "I did it," she wailed, her voice raw and broken, stripped of all pretense. "I hid you medicine. Not once, but many times. I wanted you to grow weak. I wanted you to fade away, so I could have your place, your house, all of Jin's love for myself. I was wrong. I see it now. Forgive me, Mother, please. I was so wrong." As the final, desperate word left her lips, a profound and absolute silence fell, so sudden it was jarring. The howling wind ceased its scream mid-note. The crashing thunder stopped. Outside, the raging river seemed to pause, its churning waters hanging in mid-air, frozen in time, a sculpture of suspended justice. The spirit healer glided into the room, her passage silent. The villagers and Jean parted before her, a sea of awe and fear. In her hands, she held a simple, unadorned wooden bowl, filled to the brim with clear, still water from the river outside. She stood between the two women, the one weakened by betrayal, the one finally broken by the searing power of her own confession. "The truth has been spoken," the healer declared, her voice now soft, but carrying to every corner of the silent house. "It has broken the shell of lies. Now it must be bound, so it may never be forgotten." She held the bowl first to Madame Surrey's lips. The old woman, stirred by the powerful, ancient magic that now filled the room, stirred, and drank a small, obedient sip. Then the healer turned to Lena. "Drink," she commanded, her tone leaving no room for refusal. "Taste the clarity of the truth you have finally spoken. Let wash the deceit from your soul." Weeping, her body shaking with relief and remorse, Lena obeyed, drinking the cool, clean water. It tasted of mountain snow and deep earth. As she swallowed, a brilliant, blinding white light erupted from the bowl, a silent, purifying explosion that flooded every corner of the dark house, consuming shadows, fear, and sin in its pure, incandescent, and merciful glow. When the light faded, as gently as a dawn, the room was returned to the soft, warm glow of the villagers' lanterns. The terrible storm was gone. The silence was now peaceful. Everyone blinked, their eyes struggling to adjust after the celestial brilliance. Then a collective, soft gasp rippled through the room. Madame Suri was stirring. Her eyelids fluttered open. She took a deep, clear, unlabored breath, the first in many weeks, and slowly, without any assistance, pushed herself up to a sitting position, the color returning to her cheeks in a healthy, rosy bloom. Jean cried out in a mixture of joy and disbelief and rushed to her side, burying his face in her shoulder. Lena also gasped, but for a different reason. The crushing, vice-like pain in her chest, the debilitating cough, the profound weakness. It was all gone, vanished as if it had never been. But as her hand instinctively went to the place where her heart had ached so terribly, she felt a searing, concentrated heat, like a brand. She pulled back the collar of her dress, her fingers, fumbling. There on her skin, directly over her heart, was a mark. It was shaped like a single, perfect, falling tear, and for a moment it glowed with a soft, silver light before fading to a pale, silvery scar. The spirit healer leaned close, her breath cool against Lena's ear, her words for her alone. "The scar will remain," she whispered, a permanent reminder etched into flesh and spirit. "It will fade only when your heart truly learns and practices the gentleness you so cruelly denied." Dawn broke over the village, clear and golden, the air washed clean and smelling sweetly of damp earth and renewal. The river had receded, not as a destructive flood, but gently, respectfully, leaving the land richer and more fertile for its passing. The banks were strewn with glittering, silver fish that flopped happily into shallow pools, and the water surface was now dotted with pristine, white lotus flowers that had not been there the day before, their petals unfurling to the new sun. The villagers, in awe, began to call it the night the spirits wept, a testament to the sorrow and the justice of the unseen world. Inside the house, the atmosphere was thick with emotion. Jean knelt at his mother's feet, his head in her lap, his broad shoulders shaking with sobs of relief and shame. "I should have seen," he cried, his voice muffled by her robes. "I should have known. I was blind." Madame Suri simply stroked his hair, her touch as gentle as ever, her forgiveness a quiet, immense, and powerful force that filled the silence left by the departed storm, healing wounds that ran deeper than the physical. Weeks later, the village had settled back into its peaceful, daily rhythm, but the memory of that night was a lesson etched into every heart. Lena was a changed woman, quieter, more thoughtful, the sharp, ambitious edges of her personality softened by the relentless grind of remorse and the gift of a second chance. One quiet afternoon, she went to the well, holding a single, perfect lotus petal she had collected from the riverbank. She dropped it into the dark water and leaned over the mossy rim to look. Her reflection looked back at her. It was her own face again, no longer mimicking Madame Suri's illness. The healthy color returned to her cheeks. But the eyes were different. They were sad, wise, and carried a heavy, earned knowledge. They had seen the monster in the mirror and had chosen to look away. She touched the faint, tear-shaped scar on her chest, which had already begun to lighten from a lurid silver to a soft, pearlescent white. "I will never hide the truth again," she whispered to her reflection, a a solemn vow to herself, to the spirits of the river, and to the family she had wronged. Never, as she spoke the words, meaning them with every fiber of her being, the scar on her chest flickered with a soft, warm, golden light and faded, just a little bit more, as if in approval. Years passed. The story wove itself into the very fabric of the village, becoming a folk tale told to guide the young and remind the old. On quiet evenings, the children would gather by the spirit river, and the elders would sit on smooth stones, their voices blending with the murmur of the water, and tell them the tale of the daughter-in-law who hid the medicine. They would speak of Madame Suri's boundless kindness, the spirit healer's ancient power, and the terrible, precise justice of the curse of reversal. The storyteller, often old Hannah herself, would always end by looking at the young, impressionable faces gathered around, their eyes wide in the flickering firelight, reflecting the stars above. And so, the river reminds us, the elder would say, her voice as raspy as the river stones, that every act, seen or unseen, has its consequence, a ripple in the great water of life. Your choices are like stones cast into its current. The ripples they create will always return to your own shore. The story would end, and the only sound would be the eternal, whispering flow of the river, a constant, gentle, yet firm murmur of the old, simple truth that binds all humanity, a heart that hides truth can never hide from its own shadow.